Some world leaders are using the UN climate summit to call on wealthier nations to make good on promises to help smaller countries fight climate change. Much of the focus of the past few days has been on leaders from larger nations coming together. Dozens of countries agreed to major pledges like ending deforestation and cutting methane emissions over the next 10 years. But many smaller and poorer countries disproportionately bear the effects of global warming and are pleading for financial help now, using the summit to call out larger nations to live up to their promises. For more on this, I want to bring in Gyude Moore. He is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's also the former Minister of Public Works for Liberia. Mr. Moore, welcome. Great to have you with us. So many of the issues discussed during the summit were about what can be done in the next 10 or 20 years to help fight climate change. But for many countries, the effects are already upon them. Egypt's president spoke at the summit saying despite not being responsible for the climate crisis, Africa is suffering the worst consequences from global warming. So can you give us some insight on what countries, specifically those in Africa, are dealing with right now due to climate change?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think first, one would notice that 60%, over 60% of the population depends on some form of agriculture. That agriculture is usually not irrigated. That agriculture depends on the rain. So any disruption in the weather means that there are famines, there are droughts. And one of the places where that's happening at the moment is actually in Madagascar, where there is a climate induced drought. At exactly the same time, there is a pandemic. Now, in places where the rains have failed, when the rains actually fall, it is so ferocious, it leads to flooding and destruction. And so even before, while we're talking about this is already happening. It's having an effect on countries. And so when small countries talk about the effect of these on their ability, is livelihoods that are being destroyed even at the moment as we speak.
Right. And so what do nations like these in Africa and so many others, Libya, Egypt, Honduras, so many others, what do they need right now from richer nations to help protect themselves from the effects of global warming?
I think it's twofold. I think on the one hand, they need assistance for mitigation. So, for example, they need assistance to be able for better seeds that are able to withstand the heat, seeds that are able to withstand flooding. And when these things do happen, for example, 2 years ago, there was a massive cyclone in Mozambique. Up to today, the Beira still hasn't been rebuilt. So they're looking for mitigation when this happens. They're also looking for assistance for adaptation. What are the things they're supposed to do? Build infrastructure that can withstand this, be able to secure their cities and their towns. And for most of them, because they're so poor, it is difficult for them to finance these adaptation and mitigation methods themselves. And they've been looking to their wealthier counterparts to provide that. The second thing they're looking for, though, is that even as we reduce the use of fossil fuels, they're arguing that there has to be some sort of transitional role for some kind of fossil fuel. So, for example, most people in sub-Saharan Africa use either charcoal or wood to cook, and that has led to up to 3 million deaths. Right? So they're saying, why can't we use liquefied natural gas to cook instead of you cutting down trees to be able to do this? So they're arguing on the one hand for resources to be able to mitigate and adapt, but they're also asking that in the process of the path to net zero, that there would be some transitional role for natural gas in their energy mix.
So, this has been attempted to be addressed before. Nations did come together about 12 years ago to pledge $100 billion from richer nations to go to less wealthy ones by 2020. That promise was broken, and all of that money has not made it to the nations that need it. So first off, is that money coming from that first pledge? And what does that tell you about how likely these smaller nations are to get any future funds from these wealthier countries?
So despite really, really creative accounting, we still haven't, the richer countries of the world still haven't actually met that goal. And so it sort of casts doubt on the ability of the rich countries of the world to be able to do this. So for example, India is saying that they can phase out by 2070, but will require about $1 trillion in assistance to help with that. In sub-Saharan Africa, the South African president is saying that the entire continent requires around 240 billion, even though the Nigerian president is saying Nigeria alone requires about 400 billion. So there's significant sums of money that we're talking about here. But I think it's important to point out that when the rich countries are threatened, they actually find a way to respond. Over the last 18 months, the richer countries have spent over $10 trillion responding to the pandemic. And so if they see the climate crisis as existential, then these numbers would not amount to much because they will be able to present it. So on the one hand, from what we've seen in the past, it doesn't seem likely that we're going to get the support we require, especially across the poorer countries of the world. But when we see how much the rich countries have spent because they appreciated the risk that the pandemic posed, then it is possible that we might be able to get the financing required to help smaller countries adapt.
Right. To be totally cynical about it, you know, the richer countries face all kinds of repercussions from the accelerated pace of poorer countries experiencing climate change. Number one, you know, massive climate immigration, right? So there are all sorts of effects on the richer nations that would argue that they need to give a hand to these needier nations. So what promises or pledges were made at COP26 that would help these lower income countries? Can we expect anything immediate to come out of the summit?
Yeah, I think you're right. Even if the rich countries have been self-interested, the best thing they can do is to help the poorer countries there and reduce all of the pressures that would come, including climate migrants. I think one was a pledge to phase out deforestation by 2030. One was a pledge to cut down methane emissions. And there seemed to be sort of a growing consensus around providing some sort of support. So, for example, South Africa got an agreement with the wealthier countries for $8 billion to help in the transition process. That is a drop in the bucket. It's really, really small, but it's a good first step. So I think because the G20, which comprises 80% of the largest emitters in the world. 80% of emissions in the world come from the G20. Because the G20 meeting didn't come up with any ambitious targets, it was always not likely that COP26 itself would come up with that. But what we've seen come out, especially deforestation, especially methane, it is a step forward. And one hopes that in the coming months, and at least at COP27, we'll see something more ambitious.
Gyude Moore, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
My pleasure.